My name is Ginn. I spell it G-I-N-N, like the drink. Pronounce it Ginn. Christian name is Skelton, which is a family name, Yorkshire family name. It's rather awkward name, so I'm always known as Skelly, so Skelly Ginn is me. I was a major in REME, because retired, of course. At the beginning of the war, when I joined in 1936, REME, of course, wasn't formed, and I was commissioned as an ordnance mechanical engineer. And there were about 28 of us at the time, and we were put on a course, and the course was some 18 months long, most of it at the Military College of Science, which in those days was in Woolwich, and we had various attachments to various regiments or units that were using some of the equipment, but the purpose of the course was that we were to learn to maintain and repair all weapons used in the army. A most interesting job. I'd heard of somebody who'd done this, and I thought, well, I must do the same, and this is why I joined. And I was commissioned in 1936. After the course, I was posted to Colchester, and Colchester I was attached to the 5th Inniskilling Dragoon Guards. Now they were a cavalry regiment who were just getting light tanks, and as an ordnance mechanical engineer I was to help them maintain their new equipment. Of course I was very quickly known as their mechanical vet. For my attachment I had 12 or 15 craftsmen with me, armourers of course, vehicle mechanics, vehicle electricians, welder, driver, storeman. We had quite a store lorry when the war started. A recovery lorry with a good winch on it to get even moved onto the light tanks that would run off the road or got stuck in the mud. The recovery lorry had a little crane on it which was useful for changing engines in tanks and other vehicles. Now, I joined him in 1938, so by the time the war blew up, my war job was to go to war with them, with my light aid detachment, because we'd got to know one another very well beforehand, so we all worked very well, and I'd got to know the equipment and what stores I wanted to take when we went to war. And of course, as everybody knows, the BEF went out to the north of France, some of the mining towns there, and that's where we started our war. The worst part of this was that there was a long and hard frost in France in 39-40. It was the longest and hardest in living memory, apparently. As an instance, people were driving vehicles about on the ice on the canals. Because this made a lot of work for us, frozen radiators and so on. I mean, they had to be drained not only at night, but as soon as they'd been finished with. And of course, soldiers aren't very reliable in draining these things, but I must say the Inniskillings didn't have a lot of trouble, because people soon found that they were on pack drill if they allowed their vehicle to freeze up. Incidentally, our light aid detachment didn't deal with frozen radiators, so we had the backup of workshops, which are now REME workshops behind us. The other trouble at that time, the electrics on all vehicles are only 6 volt. If you can think of 6 volt batteries in frosty weather with biggish engines, you can see there's a great deal of starting problem. So a lot of our problems were, in those days, jump leads hadn't been invented, hadn't got the nice clip, so we were making up extra leads for putting extra batteries in the circuit. It was rather tempting to put the other next 6-volt battery in and make 12 volts of them. This was very effective, and it didn't seem to burn the motors out. The only snag was if anybody had left the lights turned on. It made a lot of extra work. The worst trouble was, although the radiators could be drained, the water pumps always seemed to have some water left in them, so we had a lot of mechanical troubles. We began to turn the engine, and the leak-proof bush where the rotating spindle goes through were destroyed whenever they returned, and of course spare parts were absolutely the whole of the BF were looking for these bushes, and they ran out. But somebody had the bright idea of using balsa wood. We had a lathe with our workshop. We had a workshop lorry, so we were continually using this balsa wood, which is a hard, easily worked wood, popular with model makers. We were making these bushes up, not only for ourselves, but I think some of our neighbours as well. Anyhow, that kept us fairly busy. Now, I had a lucky stroke. Soon after Christmas, got away from all this unpleasant work, shall I say. The second in command of the Enniskillings was given command of the Lothian Borders. Now, the Lothian Borders were the cavalry to the 51st Highland Division. And he came to me and he said, now, if I could arrange it, would you be willing to come with me for a few weeks and sort out my light aid detachment there, which seems to be one bit bouncing up. So of course I jumped to it, and he said the carrot is that we are going down to the Maginot Line, and so we shall be in touch with the Germans instead of hanging about here in North France. Of course, when we got down to the Maginot Line, it was somewhere near Metz, eastern France, of course. We found we weren't in the concrete forts, but we were in what is known as the ligne de contact in front, and a sort of no man's land in front of the forts. And I suppose no man's land was roughly a mile wide, I don't really know. And all the villages and farms in this no man's land had been evacuated. So they were all stood empty there, and it was really a very pleasant country to be in. And we'd got the run of using farm buildings for our workshops and sleeping wherever we liked. And of course, all the early part of the war, the French army had been occupying this area. They had, typically I suppose the French, they'd got a very good understanding with the Germans on the other side, and they didn't seem to give it either of them give one another very much trouble. Now, as an example, we'd all got electric light. Now, sorry. The electric light overhead wires, of course, crisscrossed no man's land all the way along. So it was quite obvious that we were both using the same electric supply. And the French said, for goodness sake, whatever you do, don't be tempted to cut the electricity off from the opposite side, because they'll do the same. The whole of the French army will be without electric light, and your life won't be living after that, I can assure you. So another little warning they gave us, that if you left them alone, they'd leave you alone. But they said one of their little tricks is to use their artillery. Now, I must say it wasn't quite trench warfare. We had sort of blockhouses, shall I call them, but made of wooden tree trunks and so on, strengthened with wood, and there'd be just a platoon in these blockhouses, which were, I don't know, should I say 300 or 400 yards apart. The idea was that this should stop infiltration up between the forts. Now and again the Germans were said to put down a box barrage with their artillery round one of these blockhouses so that it couldn't be reinforced, and then their infantry would come in and take prisoners to take them away and see who they'd got in front of them. Now here's a job for our tanks, because obviously there wasn't very much for the tanks to do up there. If one of these things happened, the tanks would immediately rush down, come try and cut the Germans off as they were retiring with their prisoners. But in fact, as far as I know, nothing of this sort did happen to us while we were there. Actually, the balloon went up on, I believe it's about the 14th of May, that's 1940 now. First we were aware the sky was full of German bombers. Of course, they were going over to Holland and Belgium at that time. But there wasn't very much activity on our front. We waited there as usual for some, I don't know, so I say 3-4 days, because our lines of communication were getting a bit scattered by then, because by then the BEF, of course, had moved into France and Belgium where the attack had come. Most of our other divisions had gone there. We were left out really like a blister on our own. But then came the story we were going to move, and the BEF were in some trouble, the place we'd never heard of called Dunkirk, and we were going in to relieve the BEF. Quite what anybody thought, I don't really know. But anyhow, we were all put on trains. The whole of the 51st Highland Division were put on trains near Metz, and we lived on the trains for some 2-3 days and nights. And when we disembarked, we found we were near Abbeville. Abbeville is on the French coast, near the mouth of the River Somme. Well, we found we had to hold the River Somme, a length of it, I don't know, about 4 miles, a longer stretch than most divisions hold, I believe. And the French were holding the lines of the river further inland on our right, and the Germans to the other side of the Somme. This is the time when we learnt that Dunkirk, the evacuation was going on at this time. Well, obviously we ought to put in an attack to try and cut. It was Rommel, we learned afterwards, it was Rommel's Germans the other side, and we ought to put an attack up towards the north and cut their lines. And this with cooperation of some, but I don't know why we didn't do this on our own. We were told we wanted the French to help us. We wanted help from the French, and the French never seemed at all interested. True, some cavalry turned up at one time, but the attack never went in. In fact, what happened, it came the other way round. The Germans attacked, they came over the river very quickly, and after a couple of days, of course, it was decided we should do the retiring, and we retired to the next little ditch or stream and held that for sort of a couple of days, and then the next night we made another retirement, and this went on, I really can't remember, somebody else probably will, but it was about a fortnight doing retiring back towards Dieppe or the Havre, and we assumed the French were holding the river behind us. Well, this was happening because Dunkirk had happened by now, but Churchill was still able to stay. We have troops still fighting alongside our noble allies, the French. They didn't seem to us to be fighting very hard. Well, we heard afterwards, and we know now, that the Navy had been alerted to take us off, do a Dunkirk and take us away if they could. But on the other hand, Churchill was in touch with our Colonel Victor Fortune, and saying, for goodness sake, that he was given orders that he hadn't got to take part in the evacuation yet. He'd got to stay fighting with the French. We were under their orders, and we've got to keep them fighting for as long as possible. And then when we were eventually, the Germans got round behind us, and we were encircled, placed in the area of St. Valery, which is on the coast, and it was hoped that the Navy would be able to come in there. In fact, we were told on occasion, we were told that they were definitely coming in, and each of the units in the 51st Highland Division was given a time of the night, and we were to come into St. Valery and be taken off. This was all sort of rather exciting. Meanwhile, we were to destroy our vehicles, but we weren't to put them on fire or make a lot of fun and dance to show that we were doing. So the men had great fun bayoneting the tires of all the vehicles and hammering onto the gearboxes of the tanks and so on. I think they used the boys' anti-tank rifle to some purpose. As far as I know, nobody got hurt in all this excitement. But anyhow, came the appointed hour, and we marched our 4 miles or so into St. Valery. Because when we got there, it was in the night, because we were expecting to be taken off. The town was really half destroyed by bombing. All the inhabitants had left the place, and the Germans with their tanks were on the cliffs all round us, and of course it's absolutely impossible for the Navy to come in because it got anti-tank fire up above them. And we were told it would be fatal to go down on the beaches because the Germans' machine guns on the top of the cliffs sealed the beaches. So by now, we didn't know it, but of course Victor Fortune Churchill had been to Victor Fortune again and said, evacuate, if you possibly can, do what you can. Don't do any heroics, because you won't do any good by fighting, putting up a show. And so we were told that we were going to capitulate there, and I think there was somebody pulled up a white flag on the church tower, or quite how it all happened. And it wasn't long before we had to give up our arms and marched. We maintained a certain amount of discipline. The British marched into a field where the Germans wanted us to muster. And so the whole thing was over very quickly and quietly. The next thing is we were told we'd got to walk to Holland. After a day or so, this is what we set out to do. In fact, it took about a month. We didn't march every day. We walked about 25 miles each day. And now I'm going to tell you something that I've told very few people, a little secret of mine. But the first day we got marching, there was an open truck on the grass aside, with a lot of German generals on it, a lot of high-ranking Germans standing there, sort of gloating over the Scots that they'd taken. Well, we were marching a column of 4, and I got my overalls and army coat on. I suddenly remembered that I'd got a hand grenade in my pocket. Now, I'd been using these hand grenades when we were destroying the vehicles, stuffing them under the wheels of the vehicles and pulling the pin out so that whenever there would be a sort of an explosion for anybody who tried to move the vehicles. Anyhow, I happened to have got a hand grenade alive in my pocket as we were approaching these German generals. And I thought, of course, if I'm sure I can do an underhand lob into there and they'll never see who threw it. And as we were approaching there, I hadn't got very long to make up my mind, but I because I hadn't been a prisoner very long. I didn't know quite what the law was about what prisoners could do in this sort of thing. Anyhow, I marched up there, and as a short time looking, because you could see a lot of guards standing round with their Tommy guns or machine guns round, and of course round us we got our guards, some with bicycles, and it soon became clear to me that although I might be able to lob the thing out without being seen, there was absolute slaughter around here, not only myself, but all my pals around. We would have all been mowed down. So, in fact, I didn't throw the Mills bomb, but I never dare tell anybody about this, because I thought, I wonder what the law, what the rules would be, but I pictured myself being court-martialed for showing cowardice in the face of the enemy. Anyhow, as I say, this is about the first time I've really told everybody about this.
It didn't search you, wasn't it?
It was, yes, yeah. We sort of trusted to hold our pistols and things in, but they were rather slack about it, obviously. Anyhow, we, on the march, I expect other people have told you tales of this. The civilians, to a certain extent, were quite helpful in the way of supplying food, because the cows were milked in the farms and they couldn't get rid of the milk, so pails of milk were set out on the sides of the road that we could dip into on the way. At night we were held in churches, football grounds, one place proper prisons. We were held fairly strongly there, but everywhere the Red Cross, the Belgian Red Cross or the French Red Cross, were allowed to come in and take shopping lists. We put money and they'd go and do shopping for us, because you see, we thought we were very lightly equipped. We thought we were going to get on a boat and go home. So people hadn't got their razors, and certainly socks. Socks were a great thing that seemed to be worn out on the march. And the Belgians, the Red Cross did all they could in the way of supplying there. There wasn't much food available, but they were helpful. Because the French all the time, there were masses of the division, I don't know, it would be 6,000 or 7,000 of us, I suppose. So they weren't prepared for feeding such large number of prisoners all of a sudden, and the food was very short. Now, the French, because most aggravating them, they seem to be ready for this prisoner job. They were there with their best uniforms, carrying suitcases, and they really, it's as if they were going on their holidays. They got everything with them. It was very aggravating for them. And of course, what they were saying was, "Who's this man Churchill? Whatever does he think he's doing over the other side of the canal, over the channel there? Ever on earth is good does he think he's doing? Why doesn't he make some arrangement with Hitler? Then we could all go home." Well, of course, we didn't like the French very much. And we eventually got into Holland, were put on barges and taken up the Rhine and onto railways, and we came to the camp of Laufen. Because tremendous overcrowding there. It was a great thing in most of the prisoner of war camps, overcrowding, but Laufen was especially bad. Myself was one of over 50 of us were put in one room. We all happened to be captains. I think they tried to keep the ranks together, and the normal sort of bunks to sleep on, the 3 high. Now the first thing the Germans did, of course, was to cut our hair. We were all shorn. I was saying, well, of course, you couldn't recognize anybody after this, and we didn't like the Germans very much either after this. then things settled down a bit in this camp. We began to get used to being in camp. The world seemed to go on outside without us. It's a very good lesson for one, I think, to go to prison for a few months. Now, I was involved in an escape which I don't think many people know about in Laufen. It was unsuccessful. It involved a pigsty. Down near the wash place was a cellar. The cellar was underground. There were no windows to it. The only entrance was a very strong door at the top of the staircase, stone steps. The only window to this was about a foot square patch in the wall with bars on it, of course. I think it must have been a dungeon or a prison of some sort, that's what you thought it must have been. The Germans didn't get it into it. They used to look in this grill with the torches and so on. Well, it wasn't long, of course. We had the floorboards up above it and broken through the arch bricks at the top and slipped down in one corner where they couldn't see. Well, the next thing to do was to put some chalk lines round, people looking in through this window or grill, see how much they could see it, because the corners were quite blind. Well, of course, we chalked on the walls and on the floor, and promptly started tunnelling. Somebody got a real thing, rather like a crowbar, something with concrete reinforcement. I don't know where it ever came from, but it wasn't long before we'd managed to get through the brick wall foundations. And from looking out of the window above, we could see there was quite a narrow lane with the farm buildings opposite. So it didn't take us very long to get over, and the spoil from the tunnel, of course, could be hidden in the corners inside the chalk lines. And the Germans hadn't got the key, I don't know what, but they never opened the door. I ever felt inclined to open the door. Sometimes in their rounds they'd look through this grill. But anyhow, it wasn't long before we got through and under the next building, and thought we'd go up the floor above us. Unfortunately, it was a concrete floor above us, and working along to the wall edge, a bit of a crack, we eventually managed to wear the concrete down at the edge, and something exciting happening up above. We found we were in a pigsty, and of course the pigs seemed to be as keen to get down through this small hole we'd made as we were to get out. We managed to get a mirror up and have a look, and sure enough, it was a pigsty. It'd be a wonderful place to get into, to escape from. Well, of course, there was a sentry who walked up and down this lane, so we couldn't do very loud hammering, but with this arm bar, we kept working away and sort of getting an odd stone or so out of the concrete floor, which seemed to be some 3 inches thick, working her up to the edge by the wall. But we never did get out there. We've weeks and weeks working away at this. Incidentally, there were no lights down there. We had little oil lights that we, rather like a candle or a little tin with some cooking oil in it and a bit of pajama as a wick. And that was all the light we had. There were no windows down there. And anyhow, it's a story that I don't think many people know about.
How long would the tunnel have been, Skelly?
The width of a lane, which, I don't know, what is it, about 20 feet, I suppose. And then under the 2 walls. Because you say, well, why didn't we go further and get beyond the building? Well, we hadn't got the space to put the soil. We'd only got the space in the corners where we could hide it, and we couldn't go any further for lack of space. And actually we were moved from the camp before we got any further with this. The next move was to Warburg. Now this was a wooden camp, a very large area camp, wooden huts, and again we got a very cold winter here. It's interesting to note that if you put your boots on the ground, on the wooden floor at night, they used to get frozen down. It gives you some idea of the amount of
This would have been
penetrating of the frost.
the end of 1940, would it?
Yes,
Yeah.
Possibly, yes, it'd been the winter of 40-41, yes. Now, Warburg, one of the escapes was what known as the Wire Job, and I don't believe many people know about that. It was a success. I wasn't involved in the escape, but I was asked whether there was any chance of putting the lights out on the perimeter. The point being that there was, in our camp, there was another compound sort of wired off, in which some of our orderlies were repairing boots. They were allowed to be in there, and it was sort of a cobbler's shop. And they had electric power in there for their polishers, or I don't know what, but the power came into it, fairly thick cables, and we could see that they connected with the same wires as on the perimeter. There were something like 8 thick wires round, and I was asked my opinion, and because one couldn't start staring up at the wires, the Germans would soon get suspicious of what was going on, so it took me some couple of days or more to decide that yes, if we shorted the wires in the cobbler's compound, it would put out the wires on a certain section. Well, meanwhile, the escape gang, or gangs, had been doing athletic training and had made themselves some parallel bars and things of this sort that athletes do use, and sort of ladder-shaped things. Now, it sounds impossible, but in fact they made up some ladders. Now remember, these were wooden huts we were in. Up in the roof you could see the bare joists and so on about, and they managed to perhaps use some of these and hide the ladders that were made. This ladders must have been getting on for a month, and the practice for this, the preparation. The ladders were, there were at least 2 of them, I believe more. They were made a normal ladder, then another section which went over the top as a bridge across the top of the thick wire, with a rung at the far end onto which, if you ran over the top, you could take hold of the last rung, lower yourself down and drop down with your pack. And so this was all rehearsed and so on, and it's amazing to think they managed to get away with this in the camp, pretending they were doing other exercises. That I just heard from the orderlies that in the boot place, in the cobbler's thing, there was a main switch with the old-fashioned type of bare, I call it a knife switch, the bare copper slices with a handle, which was opened, and it was all bare copper anyway. Well, if an iron tool was put across these terminals, obviously it would short out the wire, short out the current, and this was all arranged, and one of the younger members could climb into this enclosure, which is a part of our enclosure, and put an iron bar across, and the lights would go out. Well, this was done, and it was very realistic. The as soon as the bar was put across, the lights dimmed. They didn't go out at once, and they dimmed down, and then suddenly the fuse went, rather like they would be put out for an air raid. So we hope this wouldn't arouse the Germans' suspicion. Well, anyhow, the ladder gangs went into action. I'm not sure how many there were certainly 2 or more, and about 8 or 10 people got over each of these ladders in the short time before the Germans were alerted, and there was something 20 or 30 people got out, and some of them got home. Well, at least 3 of them made a home run from that escape. A little touch about this was a suggestion when the iron bar was put across the terminals to short it, tie a string on it, so that from outside the compound, we didn't have to go in again, we could pull the string and the bar would come off the terminals, and we hoped that the Germans wouldn't know how we'd put the lights out, but whether that worked or not, I never did know. So that's on the Warburg. Now, our next camp we moved to was Eichstätt. Now, Eichstätt was one of the most civilized camps we've ever been to. I have likened it to a college, an educational college, because it really was educational. Because there were a lot of young people all wanting a job afterwards. We weren't going to stay in the army for long. And a lot of people were working for professional exams. It sounds amazing, but the British Red Cross were very helpful with this. You could get technical books brought in, ordered and delivered by we could, in fact, sit exams. It sounds very difficult, but we did sit exams. That now sitting guilds exams were arranged to be taken in there. There was certain National Diploma of Agriculture, and in addition, some people, probably through their parents, had got sponsors from solicitors' offices or other professions, who were probably looking for young men after the war to come back to their offices. And quite a number of the professions were allowed to sit some of their exams, not finals of course, for accountants and so on. Now, of course, amongst the territorials there would obviously be quite a number of schoolmasters who perhaps were known at home, and people at home would perhaps trust them to be invigilators at these exams. Now, because there were a lot of lecturing and discussion groups and so on, and really, as I say, the whole atmosphere was very much like that of a college.
Was that another wooden camp?
No, well, partially. It was mainly a barracks. It had been a German army barracks, and most of it was brick buildings, with the addition of some wooden ones, yes. But now, Eichstätt is where the Great Escape, which seems to be fairly well known, that quite a lot of people who went to Colditz went via this tunnel. It started in one of their lavatories. Some very patient people managed to lift 4 tiles from the floor, cemented these into a block or trap, say, and managed to lift these out to start a large cavity down below, to dig a cavity below from which a tunnel could be made. The idea of having a cavity, a cellar at the beginning of the tunnel, was that spoil could be stored there, and when the disposal gang went into action, it didn't have to be disposing every day and all the day. It could be managed much more efficiently in this way. So the tunnel started from quite a big cellar under the loo.
How did you dispose of the soil?
Now the soil from that, it's always very difficult. Some of it was disposed of under the wooden huts, which are some way off, but of course people living in the wooden huts didn't want attention drawn to them as if they were tunnelling. In fact, perhaps they were anyway, so that was really out for a while. The other way, in a very efficient way, is make bags, earth bags from trouser legs, have the trouser leg in your own trouser leg, and as you're walking around various grounds, you let soil dribble out from the bottom as you walked round, and this is quite a very efficient way of disposing of the soil. It didn't seem to show anywhere, and it all got trodden in with the various parts were walking. Yes, actually it's so much to go in, but I was involved in a tunnel in every camp I was in, so I claim to have tunnelled under the wire in all of them, but no, this was the only one where we made a successful break. There were three of us. There was Hamilton Bailey and Frank Weldon and myself. We three were involved, sort of leaders in tunnels in all the camps where we were. Frank Weldon, incidentally, was one of the people who were involved in eventing, horse riding, badminton and so on, shortly after the war. Now, going on about the tunnel, because ventilating the tunnels was another thing, which a lot of tunnelling had been done, and a lot of people thought they were experts at all this thing. But anyhow, the great thing was to make up an air pipe from empty tins clipped together. We chose something about 4-inch diameter, which were Klim tins, it's milk powder tins, and these were put end to end and buried into the foot of the tunnel, in the earth of the tunnel. Some people made up fans of various sorts from cardboard and wood, and had to sit there and turning them, rotating a sort of centrifugal fan to blow air down the pipe, which would be extended as the tunnel was extended. The pipe would be extended to the end. Well, we had a marvelous idea here. Next to the lavatory there was a room which had a fireplace in it, and we extended a small diameter hole up we could put these tins. We took this up to the grating under the fire. Now, as you know, there's always an updraft from a chimney in a fire, and this particular room was given extra fuel. We arranged it all give a little bit of fuel so we could keep the fire going all the time, so there was always ventilation being drawn up this air pipe. The air pipe would be taken up to the face where it was working, so stale air would always be drawn out and new air would be going in from underneath this lavatory floor. There would be various places where air could leak down into our tunnel, so that was that problem solved.
You're actually pumping air out of the tunnel?
That's right, yes. Right. It was being sucked up the chimney continuously. Now the other thing was disposing of the soil from the working face of the tunnel. It was quite, if you think of it, the soil has all got to be brought back to the end, up a very narrow tunnel, and you couldn't expect somebody to be crawling up and down carrying it. And various people had ideas of making railways and wooden trucks in which to convey this thing and pull it by string from the ends. Well, of course, there was a lot of labour and material being used unnecessarily. We found the obvious thing was to use a metal basin, wash basin, with a hole each side of it and strings so it could be pulled up to the face and then pulled back full of earth. And it slid beautifully along our tunnel, along the tunnel floor.
What was the soil like there?
Well, it was rather gravelly in this particular place. We had obstructions of quite large rocks which couldn't be moved, and so we had to divert the tunnel either round or over these great rocks. Usually there wasn't room to go up, to go over, so it would be under. So it made Hamilton Bailey rather a difficult job for his surveying, making sure we're keeping the tunnel straight and level in the direction where we wanted to go. This particular tunnel was going under quite a busy road onto a hillside where we were going to break. There was a hut up the big. We were aiming to get behind this hut, and eventually this is what we did do. These rocks did give us that rather problem, and we sort of thought, well, they might slip or something under the roadway, but fortunately they didn't. For the actual break, we were looking out of the windows. We could survey a little bit where we wanted to go up the hillside, and we could see a path where it would be out of sight of the guards, the best advantage. In fact, the first people out taped a path for us to follow, and there were something like 50 people got out of this tunnel. Very successful escape. I was given number 8 number out, but as I've said before, getting out of a camp was one thing, but getting it home was extremely difficult, especially at this time of the war, because their equivalent of the Home Guard was so efficient. I mean, they got practice every night. There were air crews being shot down, and they were trying to escape. And these Home Guard, in many cases they were teenagers with father's gun. They were rather apt to be trigger happy, so we were rather frightened of them anyway.
What time of the war was this, Skelly?
May time. A very good time to be out, and you hope to be able to feed yourself with some of the produce in the farm. Farm.
Would that have been 1943?
I think it was. Maybe 2 or 4, I think it was 3. Do you know, it's a funny thing, I've been asked before what date I went to Colditz, and I couldn't remember then. But there were many of us who went at that time. Because moving about the country was virtually impossible at that time. The other way, of course, was with the help of the escape committee, and the forgers were there making passes of various sorts and the various stories of how these were arranged. For instance, other ranks who could work, do forced labour in factories and so on, they had to move about the country from time to time apparently, and we were in touch with some of their other camps, and we knew a little bit of the law. But if you could arrange to be a working party moving to another town or so on, this was an ideal thing, going by train. And you would arrange to have a Pole or a Czech with you who was a good German speaker. This would be a great help, because the Pole or Czech would be very pleased to come with the British, because if they were caught again, if it is caught, the Czechs were quite likely to be liquidated. Whereas if they were with the British, they thought the British were better, a better chance of being sent back to the camp. The Germans were a little bit more careful what they did with them, and it just turned out to be quite true in many cases.
Did you have other nationalities in Eichstätt?
There's certainly a lot, yes. It made it very interesting. There were certainly Poles and Czechs and Dutch. The Dutch were very friendly, and some reason there was some, well, the Dutch East Indias. I don't know quite how they got there, but I suppose they'd volunteered for the army in Holland, but there were all sorts of people wanting to learn languages. It was a good place.
It sounds as though the escape department, shall we call it, in Eichstätt was well established then, with forges and...
Oh yes, they were as well equipped as any of the other camps, yes.
So when you got out, did you go on your own, or were you...
I was Boy Scouting on my own,
oh, right.
Yes. And sort of lying up in bushes and so on at night, in the daytime, and I thought, well, they'll obviously, such a big escape, they'll be searching for us all in the area, but I understand they didn't make great search. I don't know, well, we don't really know, but they relied on this sort of home guard thing, which has stopped people moving about anyway. Now, when we were captured, I, amongst others, were marched to a railway station just to be held for a while, and we weren't taken back into camp because I suppose we would have had local knowledge which would have been useful for anybody escaping after us. So they didn't put any of us back into the camp. They took us to some old disused slosh of old castle, and they put guards around it temporarily while they collected us all before they put us on a train for Colditz. Well, one little thing always sticks in my mind of this castle, what I call their air lavatory. You just have to go up a tower and stick your bottom on and pole out of a sort of long slot window, and the rubbish was disposed of down at the bottom of the wall. This apparently worked all right in olden days, but there was trouble if the wind was wrong. When you let go of the paper, it was apt to come in over your shoulder and over your head. One thing I remember about that particular castle.
Do you remember where it was you were recaptured?
Well, no, I haven't got the name of the place, but it wasn't very, very far away from Eichstätt. We incidentally had very good maps of Eichstätt, and we could see where we were, but I've forgotten now.
So how long were you
river
actually
crossing.
out?
I was out 4 nights.
4 nights.
And I was very glad to get in again, actually.
Was everybody recaptured, or did any?
Yeah, from that one, everybody was recaptured. There were no home runs at all.
You were all sent to Colditz en bloc?
Yeah, that's right, yes. I don't know, I believe there were some delays with some of them, but anyhow, yes, that's virtually what happened.
Can you remember your first view of Colditz Castle? I presume you were taken by train?
Yeah, by train, yes. We arrived in the evening, the light was poor, I don't know, I can remember marching up a long slope to the gates, yes, I don't know. Now, the search there, I can remember, up to then I had retained an adjustable spanner, which had always, I hoped, be useful. And I had it with me. Well, going up to the search there, we went up a staircase, and I thought, well, I put the spanner on one of the steps. I hit it on the end of one of the steps. I thought, well, perhaps I'll get the chance to pick it up on the way down again. But when I went down again, it had gone. So whether the Germans or another greedy cockets, I don't know. That's one little thing I can remember of arriving. But from my point of view, Colditz was the most comfortable camp that I'd been in. Now it happened that my promotion had come through by then. I was now a major, and people of field rank were put in a separate part in Colditz called the Saal House, that's right. And so we had a little bit more room for ourselves there. So any of us who wanted to continue with our studies and reading of technical books and so on, it was much easier, although I must say that the general atmosphere there was rather anti-study. Discussion groups and so on certainly did go on. It is quite interesting. But of course I soon learnt to be, actually I was, as an ordnance mechanical engineer, I was the only REME, we had now been put into REME, I was the only REME member there, and people used to consult me over things. I don't know, they thought I knew how to temper a screwdriver and that sort of thing, what colour time to temper it to. Those are the sort of questions I got asked. But I soon learnt of the workshop in which the glider was being built, and I soon got involved in this. Now, the workshop was used for other things, not only for the glider. I was responsible for the big wheel, which again I don't believe everybody knows about, but the radio receiver from England, not BBC in those days, but anyhow you know that every camp had its secret radio to receive home. Now of course the news from it was circulated by a news reader every night coming round to the various rooms and huts. The Germans were aware of this and assumed that he was reading the translation of the German papers, which everybody couldn't read. But of course, in fact, it was both that and the British news. So we thought we were better informed than anybody where the front line would be. We heard the German version of it and the British. I don't think I was ever presented with the problem, but it's sort of thing one thinks about at night or so on. But I knew this radio, there was occasionally messages for prisoners of war in some coded way, which I have no reason to know of. And I thought, well, I wonder how, we'd often wondered how the war was going to end, and I could visualize that there could be chaos in the country and the electric light would be turned off, which would mean that we wouldn't be able to use the radio, which was a mains set. Incidentally, it made the problem a little easier. It was direct current mains where we were. We knew this because in different ways the electric light had been used for magnetizing compass needles. You know, you put a few turns of coil around a steel needle, it would magnetize it. And incidentally, boiling water was used. Bits of iron wire which people had arranged to put into their mugs and connected into the light. They used to boil up their ersatz coffee again on making shaving water and so on. So always in short supply. So we used to interfere with electricity sometimes, but anyhow, it came to me that towards the end of the war, just when we wanted to be getting messages for prisoners of war, we might be without the radio. And I suppose over some long period thinking, I remembered that the chapel, we had a chapel which was some sort of, what is the word, it's out of bounds for escaping trips, I don't know.
Parole.
That's right, it was sort of parole. We were allowed to use this chapel, various denominations. Scottish people are always inventing other denominations, some reason to use the chapel. Anyhow, that didn't matter. But in the chapel there was an organ, and it had an electric motor on the blower. And it suddenly came to me that electric motor can very easily be converted into a dynamo. And in which case, there was a source of electricity here that ought to be tapped, and it came to me that if we made a large diameter wheel, something about 6 foot, and made a belt of string, there was always seems to be plenty of string from Red Cross parcels about. Incidentally, there were always ropes being made. Every camp we were in had its, do I call it a rope walk, of people who were good at twisting these things up, could work. But anyhow, we'd soon make a belt from this big wheel to drive the little pulley wheel that should be on this motor. So I put it to the escape committee, could somebody unbolt this motor and bring it out? Well, it was amazing the amount of debate there was about this. Were we breaking our parole by pinching the electric motor out? Was it helping us to escape? You can imagine the sort of arguments that went on with it. But anyhow, somebody did unbolt it and bring it to me. It was a very well-made motor, and it had, surprisingly enough, 3 brushes which could be adjusted in. And so it was very easy to convert it into a generator rather than a motor. And it didn't take very long before we had got the big wheel made, and a piece of piping which was cemented into the wall, and well, it was arranged so 1 or 2 people could rotate this, and the motor was put on a bit of a hinged board so that its own weight kept the belt tight. And next thing was measuring the voltage. I said, well, that's easy enough. We just put an electric light bulb on it, and whoever winding the wheel winds till the right amount of illumination comes on the light, and so you've got your right volts. And this was duly assembled, and the radio was tested on it and worked all right. And at the end, right at the end of the war, at the time I'm not quite sure whether we had been relieved, whether the Americans had come in or not, but anyhow, on 2 occasions it was used in anger. And we'd got the news. I don't know whether we got messages or not, I don't know. It wasn't my department to know. But
where was the wheel?
In the workshop, where the glider was built.
Is that where it was hidden when
Yeah,
it was
that's
not
right.
used?
Yes.
I see.
There were
It
lots
was a big
of
piece of furniture, wasn't it?
yes. There were lots of little funny jobs going on up there for which we didn't want the Germans to know about.
And is that where you actually built the wheel?
That's where we built the wheel. It was well, the work on the glider was going on, so there was work on other jobs going on as well.
And that was wooden, was it?
Yes, it was a wooden wheel, yes, made up of bed boards and other bits of floor boards and so on. Yes, so it was a very successful operation.
There are no photographs of that I've seen anyway.
No, very few people knew about it.
Probably suffered the same fate as the glider.
I'm sure it did, yes. Yeah. Somebody used it for firewood, I suppose.
Could we talk about some of the personalities in the camp, Skelly? When you went there, was it just purely a British camp?
Our part of the camp was certainly only British, but there were a lot of French still there, and and Poles. I'm not a very good mixer myself, so I didn't get to know, I wasn't interested in getting to know another language to talk, although I was fairly fluent at reading German textbooks, and French I could read fluently, but I didn't think I needed to speak. Although my idea was that if I ever escaped again, I would try and make contact with a farm and say that I was a farm worker, an agricultural worker, and try and get. I thought it was absolutely hopeless to try and escape, and it seemed to me the only way was that they were short of workers at the place, and it seemed to me that I might get a job on a farm, but it's wishful thinking, no doubt.
The Saal House, as you say, it was senior officers.
Yeah.
Were the senior officers of the French and the Poles, were they still there? Did they actually stay in the Saal House as well?
No, they weren't in our Saal House. No, the British were always kept. I think the Germans did this on purpose. They kept us quite separate.
Mm.
Yeah.
So where were their senior officers then? Just in.
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know whether there were many of them, or there were some very senior French officers there, because there were some French generals who had refused to capitulate. You see, all the French capitulated, and after a time they all went home anyway. But no, I can't. I'm a bad person to ask over that. I'm very bad at getting to know anybody.
Mm. But you say the Saal House was quite comfortable. You found it quite comfortable.
Well, space-wise, we weren't overcrowded in the rooms as much as
Can you remember
lower
who you
ranks
shared a room with?
Yeah, yes, there was a Miles Reed, who was he was a territorial, and he was something in the city, I think you would have said. There was Tubby Broomhall. He was a colonel in the sappers. There was another sapper, Young. Yes. Now, Anthony Anderson's father was there. Douglas Bader, of course, he wasn't in the same room with me, but he was in that area.
Colonel Todd, he was...
yes, oh yes, I was in the same mess with the senior British officer, Colonel Todd, yeah.
Was Guy German there then?
Yes, yes, wasn't the same mess with him, but yes, he was certainly there. He was an agriculturist, to talk on agricultural matters.
Do you remember any of the German officers?
No, I mean I've even forgotten the name of the security officer. That was it. It's Eggers. Yes, she's reminded me. Yeah.
And I don't suppose you had much contact with people like Preem and.
No, I personally did none at all. Although being in the same mess with this SPO, who used to meet the commandant every week or so with his sort of retinue. There were two others who used to go with him, who used to meet the thing, and I understand that he was always very reasonable with any requests that they made. Of course, food got very short, and towards the end we became very overcrowded. In fact, most of us from the Saal House were moved to other places, had to join up with others, because you see the Russians were coming from the east, and any camps there had to be moved, and so we had people from other camps brought in, mostly French, into us, and so everything ran short. Water was short. The loos didn't work. I think we had to dig earth loos in the courtyard. And of course, Red Cross parcels had been stopped a long while. The German, it wasn't the fault of the Germans. The bombing of the transport, it was quite out of the question of bringing any extra food in. When, for instance, salt, as I said to other people, salt was short. And if you can imagine eating vegetables, cold rabbi, potatoes, of course, no, without salt, it's absolutely deadly. There's very little meat, and I think I've told people before that there was a time when things were very, very short, and then suddenly came to the kitchen a horse's head, and there's some meat, and those great cheer went up. What the cooks would do with it, I don't know, but I suppose they boiled it in with a soup. But to think that was a thing that we were grateful for.
Did you find that the morale was always very good, or?
Yes, it was. Yes,
was.
There was no. I mean, a number of us used to think we'd be very lucky to get home from Colditz at all. Whichever way the war went, we were enemies of the Reich, and we couldn't really visualize the Germans allowing us home. Well, Germans that we were in contact with, not too unfriendly as I understand it, but the SS were always in the background, and the Commandant, a lot of things we used to talk about, he said, well, I daren't do that, the SS would soon be sent in. And again, if there was any big escape at that time, they thought the SS would come in and take reprisals. So the SS was a great threat over our heads all the time.
Did you hear about the Great Escape at Saarbrücken?
Yeah, oh, very much so.
And
Yes.
you knew
yes.
the outcome of that?
Yes. We knew that 50%, that Hitler had ordered that 50% of them had got to be shot. And we did hear from the Germans that, well, they were only too pleased to tell us that escape was no longer a game, no longer a game, and it was deadly. So they were very pleased to tell us this.
And did people then, towards the end of the war, become resigned to not escaping, to just sitting out the war?
Yes, yes. You see, the glider, only 2 people would have escaped from that, and it was soon thought, well, this is a nonsense to use it for an escape. So it was sort of put on one side. Now, if the worst comes to the worst and the SS came in to liquidate us, perhaps some 2 people could be got away, be able to tell the story of what had happened to us.
So that was a genuine fear, was it?
It was, well, it was amongst a number of us, yes. Some of the younger ones, I think, didn't have time to think so much about it.
Because I think you are now the sole survivor of the Saarhaus.
I think I am, yes, yes.
It's very.
Yes.
Can you remember about the actual liberation of the castle?
Yes, again, there are some things that perhaps everybody doesn't know. Preparing for the escape, or preparing for the end of the war, nobody knew how it would go. We perhaps could visualize that the country would be in chaos, and we might have to look after ourselves. In fact, we might have to almost fight our way out and arrange our own transport. The sort of the first thing, there was a fighting element organized and in a certain way drilled and discussed. They thought, well, with our spiral staircases we could make some sort of stand against the SS. If they came in, we could hold them off for a few hours anyway if they'd got to come up spiral staircases to get at us. And might even give us a chance to get the glider off.
Had you worked out plans to do that, to hold the...
Yes, certainly there was a sort of a defensive element of it. Now, my element was the transport, because not only transport, there were a lot of horses about, and the people who'd been in the cavalry. I can remember one chap, Peter Dollar. He was going to be in charge of horse transport.
You mean in the town there were a lot of horses?
Well, that's right. And you see, delivering the potatoes or whatever coming to the camp, as horses used to come, so we knew there were a lot about. And I was going to be in charge of motor transport. Well, you probably know, liquid fuel was almost unobtainable in anywhere on the continent, in France, Belgium, anywhere at all. And everything ran on producer gas, on wood chips. These wood chips. Every vehicle had this sort of slow combustion stove on it, in which burnt wood chips. Now this was arranged to be burnt in an atmosphere short of atmosphere thing, when the smoke or products of combustion were mostly carbon monoxide, which is inflammable. And it's this gas which was used to run almost all the vehicles. The army vehicles may have had more liquid fuel, but it had liquid fuel to start the vehicles with, and then they had to run on this producer gas. And the stove was kept running with the suction of the engine, and I had read this up as much as I could from technical books which we could get and the newspaper articles, and at the end, Pat Ferguson and some of us, we went down after we were released, after the Americans had released us, and we were very quickly, only 2 or 3 days before they put us, big Negro chaps came along with their lorries and drove us out. But anyhow, we went down to the town and decided we'd have a lorry. And we went up to one of the biggest lorries we could see, and ordered the chap to give us a key, and he very meekly gave us a key. We gave him a piece of paper which we'd written on in exchange. I think he was a civilian, not a soldier, but anyhow he seemed only too pleased to get away from the lorry. And we took this, it had a trailer. Now, we ran it round through a couple of farms, picked up a lot of oats and hay for Dollar's horses, and loaded up with some potatoes. And, we took oats for ourselves, thinking we might make porridge, and we collected straws in this way with this lorry which we drove. In fact, I think I've still got the key for it. So that's the thing I don't think everybody knew about. We brought the lorry up into the compound and kept it there for the 2 or 3 nights before we actually went away with the
Did he actually
Americans.
start collecting horses, Peter Dollar?
I'm not quite sure of that. Well, I think they knew where the stable was and went and took charge of the stables, because you see all the Germans had been rounded up, and I suppose perhaps the grooms had gone, I don't know. But yes, Peter Dollar was certainly was in charge of a lot of horses at the end of it.
But then you were taken away in the American lorries.
In the American lorries, yes. So what happened to it all, I don't know.
And then you were flown home?
Then, yes, I can't, was it somewhere near Wing we landed. Yes, we came in Dakotas. Yeah. We had 2, we were lifted to somewhere in France. No, we were lorried to somewhere in France, yes. And then the Dakotas took us across to somewhere near Wing when we got home.
And can you remember anything of the sort of debriefing you went through when you got home?
there wasn't a great deal. We were introduced to, what is that flea powder?
DDT.
DDT, and we all had to be puffed with DDT. I don't think, well, I know I wasn't lousy then. I had been lousy sometimes during the camp. That's one thing. But no, as far as debriefing, I can't remember very much at all. I think there was an evening when we weren't allowed home. We had to stay and give reports.
And did you stay in the army after that, or did you come out?
No, I wanted to come out as quickly as I could, because I always had been going to farm, and this was what I was going to the farm. But I had the greatest difficulty getting out. I was sort of, I was an ordnance mechanical engineer, and they were very short of good ones anyway. Had been on a full course, and I found it extremely difficult. I was a regular soldier, you see. I'd had a disability. In fact, I've lost an eye. It was actually before the war, off a blacksmith's chip off a blacksmith's hammer. While I was in Remy, during this training period, I lost my left eye, and incidentally, the Germans got me a glass eye, which is probably one of the best I've ever had, in Leipzig.
This is while you were in Colditz?
Well, before Colditz,
yes.
Before Colditz. Yes. No, you're right. It was from Colditz, yes. It was near Leipzig. Yeah.
So did you eventually get to farming then?
Yes.
Oh, you did.
Well, I really sort of, before I knew that I was going to get my discharge, I'd actually bought a farm, and had started Joyce as having to run the farm meanwhile. And I got a compassionate posting to a place near Cambridge, a vehicle depot, a Remy vehicle depot near Cambridge. So I got some help there, this compassionate posting, and there was a brigadier who spoke in my favour, saying that I'd lost my brother in the war, rather indicating that he'd been the farmer, and that we got a farm in the family, and I was the only chap who was about to get to run it. In fact, I'd only just got into it, but in fact that's how I did get my discharge eventually. But I had the greatest difficulty getting out.
Well, thanks ever so much, Skelly. I think we've covered everything on both our pieces of paper.